Good day, everybody. I'm Dean Jim Stavridis, and I'm at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. Today I'm here with the President of Estonia, and I'm very proud to welcome him to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And I'd like to take an opportunity, Mr. President, if I could ask you several questions. Sure. Let me begin with Estonia, a beautiful country of 1.3 million in Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about the current economic situation? We know that Europe has faced some economic challenges. How are things in Estonia?
Well, relatively speaking, Admiral, we're doing rather well, meaning that others are doing not so well. So that while Europe is technically in recession in many countries, we're experiencing growth. Probably a little less than 2% this year, which is very high for Europe. Yeah. By other standards, well, we are not satisfied. But what we have found, and what has sometimes gotten us in trouble and among some thinkers in the United States, is that we, in fact, have come out of the crisis largely through adopting austerity measures. We didn't have much choice because
Sure.
when the Lehman Brothers crisis hit, we couldn't really borrow anything from anywhere there, and so, or we could borrow only at such exorbitant rates it would have been counterproductive. So we adopted austerity, and in fact, those policies paid off. In Europe, you should not have, or we have all agreed not to have deficits greater than 3%, and we're basically way below that.
Yeah,
similarly, we've all agreed that we don't borrow more than 60% of GDP. We've borrowed, I guess right now it's around 11 or 12%, which went up from 7 because we had to borrow money to help bail out Cyprus and Greece.
Yeah, that's terrifically low in the context of Europe and really globally.
And then finally, I mean, while we're on the issue of following the rules, I should also point out that we're one of the very few countries in NATO that actually meets the agreed-upon target of 2% of GDP.
Yeah, Mr. President, if I could, on that note, as a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, again, thank you to Estonia. Of 28 nations, I think only a handful, including the United States and Estonia, the largest and almost the smallest, are two of the nations, which shows us that every nation can make that 2%. So thank you to Estonia for that.
Well, if I may, I just elaborate a little bit on that. See, I mean, it's our firm belief that the current situation in funding is not sustainable. The way things are going, with countries paying, I mean, half of the agreed amount percentage or even lower, at a time when the United States pays 75% of the NATO budget, representing at the same time only 1/3 of the total population of NATO. And while everyone has economic difficulties, our economic difficulties are no lesser than the difficulties of other countries, and we are convinced that you have to pay for your defense.
Yeah. While we're on that subject, as the NATO commander, I was so proud of the Estonian troops who were part of essentially every operation during the 4 years I was over there. Can you give us a snapshot of how your military's doing from your perspective, sir?
Well, again, I mean, everyone thinks they're the best, but we get a lot of compliments from, as we just did from you, we get a lot of compliments on the quality of our troops.
You bet.
We are also one of the few countries that maintains a national conscription, which enjoys about 93-94% support of the population.
It's fabulous. As you have talked about quite a bit, 21st century security is not only about conventional military strength, but it also touches on areas like cyber. Estonia is a country that knows well the challenges in the cyber world. You've been literally a global leader on this and have spoken and written about it very eloquently. Can you share with us some of your views on the cyber world and how it's unfolding today?
Well, I mean, it's a new dimension of potential warfare. In a few cases, it has been incorporated into warfare. The Small Wars Journal of January 2011 describes how kinetic warfare, which is traditional warfare, but now it's called kinetic as opposed to digital, how attacks in the Georgian War were coordinated with cyber attacks to enhance the fog of war, the Clausewitzian kind of notion. Well, what I would argue is that, in fact, what we have to think very carefully about cyber defense, because it does alter the entire understanding of what war is about. I mean, historically, ever since people started throwing rocks at each other, it's been about getting territory.
Right.
And then you have armies, or you have whatever you have, defense, various forms of defense to defend that territory. But today, in fact, you can bypass the military in many ways. You can just go. You can shut down a country without ever having a shot fired.
Correct.
In fact, think of this. I mean, if you take out the electrical system, if you wipe out the financial records or of Wall Street,
air control,
traffic control,
trains, yes, sir.
And so a country can become paralyzed, and basically the military is not in the equation.
Correct.
And of course, there are a number of difficulties as well, because in cyber, you don't know who's doing it. I mean, you may think you have a good idea who's doing it, but ultimately, the forensics of cyber attacks, you will find out eventually who did it. But it's not as if you can have an immediate response against who's doing it. Whereas with other forms of warfare, you can see on the radar where the missile comes from. You see where the troops are amassed, whatever, you know who you're shooting at or defending against. But here, you don't know who did it.
Right.
But they've done something terrible, and they've bypassed. Suddenly your F-35s and your carrier battle groups, they're irrelevant because they're not.
Exactly.
So I think we're only at the beginning of this, and I think we need much more serious thinking in this field. A lot of theoretical work, I think, needs to be done, and I would say that Fletcher PhD students have their work cut out for them.
Well, Mr. President, that's a perfect point to conclude a wonderful interview. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here to the Fletcher School. And I know you spent some years in your life studying here in the United States. We're always proud to see the President of Estonia come to an American university, to the Fletcher School. We're very proud of all that you're doing in the NATO alliance. Thank you, sir, for spending time with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great to be here.